G'day, and welcome to the Patently Strategic Podcast, where we discuss all things at the intersection of business, technology, and patents. This podcast is a monthly discussion amongst experts in the field of patenting. It is for inventors, founders, and IP professionals alike, established or aspiring. And in today's episode, we're looking into how to get more predictable results from the unpredictable arts. Think your innovation is sufficiently enabled to secure, defend, and assert your patent rights? If it's a biological, chemical, or emerging technology invention, then you might want to think again. And there's that word again, enabled. If you're a regular listener, you're probably noticing a common thread among several of our recent episodes. The concept of enablement is one of the sharpest corners in the world of IP. In Fortifying Life Science Patents, we first explored Section 112 rejections and the concept of enablement, or whether or not the patent teaches those skilled in the art how to make and use the full scope of the claimed invention without undue experimentation. In our From Alice to Axel episode, we looked at how the courts have conflated eligibility with enablement and the grave threats this poses to the innovation economy. And then in episode 8 this season, we examined the use of means plus function claiming and the enablement risks that come with using overly broad language that only describes what an invention is versus what it does. Why is this such a big topic worth so much discussion? Well, remember, enablement is the fundamental deal of the patent system. You're trading disclosure for exclusivity, so you can't hold back on the key details. Long-term progress of science and the useful arts is promoted by trading a government-granted window of exclusivity to inventors in exchange for an enabling public disclosure. This disclosure must teach the public how to make and use the invention. Enablement is teaching how to make and use the invention. That requires a certain level of specificity, and that level of specificity is where we start traveling into the gray. Depending on the subject matter or technology area for the innovation, this level of specificity can have very different requirements. Some technologies, like those rooted in physics and mechanics, are considered predictable by the U.S. Patent Office, while others, like biological and chemical technologies, are generally considered unpredictable. It follows that the amount of disclosure required to enable an invention is related to the predictability of the technology, and so-called unpredictable arts require more description to teach a reader how to make and use the technology. Similarly, emerging technologies, being less well-known, also require more disclosure to be fully enabled. In this month's episode, David Jackrell, president of Jackrell Consulting, leads a discussion along with our all-star patent panel, exploring enablement for the unpredictable arts and emerging technologies. The panel discusses peculiarities of patenting unpredictable art and emerging technologies with a focus on modern case law and statutes to arrive at a set of best practices for getting more predictable results when patenting these technologies. Dave is also joined today by our always exceptional group of IP experts, including Dr. Ashley Sloat, President and Director of Patent Strategy here at Aurora, Kristen Hansen, Patent Strategist at Aurora, and Shelley Couturier, Patent Strategist and Search Specialist. Now, before joining the group, as we often do, we'd like to provide a short primer on some key concepts in this episode for those newer to the world of patenting. Our legal scope for this talk once again falls under Title 35 of U.S. Code, Section 112, which is largely concerned with the topic of enablement. Patents can be rejected by the Patent Office or later invalidated by the courts if the invention is deemed to be insufficiently enabled. Regarding statute interpretation, the group also makes reference to the MPEP. For those newer to the space, this might sound like another snooze-worthy acronym. For practitioners and examiners, it's the Bible for patenting. MPEP stands for Manual of Patent Examining Procedure. It's a 3,000-plus page manual published by the United States Patent and Trademark Office for use by examiners, applicants, attorneys, and agents. It is the reference guide for practices and procedures for the prosecution of patent apps before the USPTO. Patent practitioners use the MPEP as a handbook of rules for drafting a patent application, and examiners use the MPEP guidelines to decide whether to grant or reject the application. Along with patent laws and rules, the MPEP also attempts to explain the Patent Office's stance on current patent case law. And in case you have trouble sleeping, we've linked to the MPEP in the show notes. As it often does, a lot of nuance comes down to understanding the difference between the spec or specification versus the claims of a patent application. We review this distinction in great depth in our Patent Anatomy episode from Season 1, but in brief, the specification describes the invention and provides context for interpreting the claims, whereas the claims are the heart of the application and point out the exact invention boundaries of the idea space the applicant believes she's entitled to own. The panel also uses the terms genus and species when talking about the breadth of a claim. Much like the traditional definitions of genus being a group defined by common characteristics, and a species being a logical division of a genus, in chemical, biotech, and pharma patents, a genus claim covers a group of related chemicals, whereas a species claim covers a single compound without coverage of analogs, derivatives, or compounds in the same family. Inventors ideally want the broadest umbrella possible with genus claims, but a big question explored in this episode is, what does that require from an enablement perspective? And the final bit of patent ease before handing you off to the panel is the concept of Marcouche groups. This is a claim drafting technique used to cover multiple related alternatives or species in a single claim. It can appear in a patent with language like selected from the group consisting of A, B, and C. The elements of the group must share some common characteristics and allow the group to be treated like a substitute variable. It is considered a closed group though, so the variable can only be one of those things when claimed in that manner. For today's conversation, the practical application is using Marcouche groups to specify groups of related chemical compounds. If you'd like to know more about Marcouche groups and structures, please check out our blog post on how to read chemical and drug patents, linked in the show notes. All right, hopefully you're now sufficiently enabled to enjoy the episode. Take it away, Dave.
Well, I'm going to jump right in because there's, I think that in a way I could breeze right through this, but at the same time, I think it'd be more interesting and fun if anybody has any comments or stories or examples of their own to like add in as we go. I don't have like specific prompts for places for that, so please, like, if you think of something or have something to mention, please chime in.
And I will, and don't laugh too hard, I've worked in predictable arts 99.99%, so I'll add some stupid questions for you.
Great. That's perfect. So, I thought, especially since, for the podcast and the broader audience out there, we'll start at the beginning. We'll start at enablement and the MPEP. We'll go through what is a predictable versus an unpredictable technology. How can we think about that? And then the meat of this is really two sections, chemical and biological technologies, which are basically the way that in this context are very similar. And then something actually interesting in a related vein, although not exactly unpredictable per se, is emerging technologies and the enablement requirement there, which is actually a little bit different apparently. So MPEP 2164. What is enablement? So this is what we call 112A. And in the specification, you describe how to make and use the invention. And that's a requirement. You have to enable someone to be able to make and use the invention in order for the patent office to grant you as a patent. And a nice piece of case law that a lot of people kind of fall back on when they're thinking about this, how to determine whether or not you've met that bar, is the test of enablement is whether one reasonably skilled in the art, a posita, could make or use the invention from the disclosures in the patent coupled with information known in the art without undue experimentation. And that's really a key phrase. And what does that mean, undue experimentation? It's a bit vague, but there's been a lot of case law around this. And essentially, if there is a number of finite possibilities that someone could explore, then that may not be, then it would be enabled if it's only a small number of possibilities. But if somebody had to do a lot of experimenting to figure something out, how to make something that worked, then that would be quote unquote undue experimentation. Again, quantitatively, that's a little bit of a tricky thing to unravel, but that's the idea behind it.
And is this why you use Marcouche groups so often in this art?
Sometimes, yeah. In some ways, yes. I think, okay. Not maybe so much for enablement, but because you want the scope of your claim to be broad, but you also want it to be specific. Because if you make something too broad, then you risk not enabling things. So by listing a specific list of things where each one of those things is enabled because it's described well, that can help you get best practice, have everything enabled.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, because I think I could say I went 15 years never using it because it's not useful in predictable R's.
Yep.
But I see it everywhere in this space. So
Yeah, it's a good,
okay,
it's a good point. I didn't think of it that way, but as we go through things, we can talk about that and like how a Marcouche group may have been better than some of these other claims, which were invalidated for lack of enablement.
Well, and then too, even some countries, what we've even been seeing, that some countries, even with kind of like Marcouche groups, they're not okay with it if you don't have enough support for all the various types of, and stuff that's like pretty routine, like detergents and things like that. They don't like it if you don't have more experimental support for, some of those other classes. So that's kind of a interesting thing too.
Right. So I thought was pretty interesting. Same section, a subsection of this in the MPEP 2164.03 is the relationship of predictability of the art and the enablement requirement. So these are quotes now, right, from the MPEP. The amount of guidance or direction needed to enable the invention is inversely related to the amount of knowledge in the state of the art, as well as the predictability in the art. So determining predictability or determining how much enablement you need, actually, you have to go back and know about the art. You need to know the state of the art, how much knowledge is out in the art, what a posito would reasonably know. And that's really the crux, I think, of both these unpredictable arts and the emerging fields. Another quote, the predictability or lack thereof in the art refers to the ability of one skilled in the art to extrapolate the disclosed or known results to the claimed invention. So in the field of chemistry, there may be times when well-known unpredictability of chemical reactions will alone be enough to create a reasonable doubt as to the accuracy of a particular broad statement put forward as enabling support for a claim. So I think, through examples, this will all become more clear. But this is all, I think the important takeaway here is this is in the MPEP. This is not sort of like something that's kind of come out well, it has come out in case law, but it's explicitly in the MPEP as well, that there's actually a different bar for different fields, depending on the state of the art, as well as the predictability of the technology. And so the scope of the required enablement varies inversely with the degree of predictability involved, but even in unpredictable arts, a disclosure of every operable species is not required. So this is something we're also going to talk about then. How do you do this? Extrapolating and teaching, you can enable someone to create a whole slew of compounds, let's say, by a number of examples, and then also instructions or some information, some description about how to extrapolate between those examples to arrive at all of the other examples that may be in a broad definition. So as we said, chemical and biological, chemical species with substitutable groups is sort of the main example of this. And we're going to talk a bit about that as we go through these examples. But also in emerging technologies, new fields, even if they're predictable, need more description to satisfy the disclosure obligations than more mature fields. So for example, broad claims that cover different embodiments need to have all of those variations enabled with a sufficient description. And as we get into the emerging technologies examples, you're going to see a pattern that arises there where someone tried to claim a genus and there are several species under the genus. One or two of those species was described really well, and a couple of the other species were not described very well, and the entire claim can be invalidated because of that. So the other thing that's really important for this is thinking about the terms and really what is the scope of this claim, and is everything that this claim covers sufficiently enabled? It's kind of the crux of it. Okay, so now some fun examples. Predictable. What is predictable? So in a very famous example of a predictable technology, which is physics. Physics, mechanical inventions are often pointed to as being predictable. So in 1916, Einstein published his theory of general relativity, which said that mass curves space-time, all on paper, all equations. Took 3 years, but 3 years later in 1919, English scientists led by Sir Arthur Eddington traveled to Africa to observe a total solar eclipse, which confirmed that the light from stars was bent by the gravity of the sun. So there's even older examples of this. The orbit of Neptune famously was predicted by the other planets around it having strange orbits, which must have been affected by another mass that someone could tell was there. So these are predictable. And I'll tell you one other, because it's I think it's very interesting, but it's also personally related. Also in 1916, Einstein predicted that gravity travels in a wave. And this one took 100 years to prove, but LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, confirmed the observance of gravitational waves in 2016. And this is personal for me, because this was the project that I worked on in grad school. I was designing photodetectors for LIGO, and there you can see some pictures of these facilities. There's one up in Hanford, Washington. There's one in Livingston, Louisiana. These interferometers are L-shaped devices that each arm of the interferometer is 4 kilometers long. And the entire path of the laser is all under vacuum. And so these are just massive, massive installations. And you can see the data on the right, which was the observation of the first gravitational wave event, which I believe was 2 black holes, or black holes or neutron stars smashing into each other. They are orbiting around each other, and at the end, right before they coalesce into one, they spin around each other so fast that they give off massive amounts of energy in the form of gravitational waves, which is what was observed. But the crazy thing is, why it took so long to find, is that the effect is so small. I don't know if you can see on those plots, but the strain is 10 to the minus 21st. So over 4 kilometers of distance, the relative change in the length of the arm is 1/1000th of the diameter of the nucleus of an atom. So like 10 to the minus 21st meters. Like extremely
insane.
Small. It is insane. And a lot of technology.
How did they like, I imagine like you get so much noise in that system. Yeah. How do you pair together that's what was causing that?
You're exactly right.
And that's and that's probably more than what we have time for today.
It is. I can give you the short answer though. So there's these plots, and these are the plots that the people who made these systems were using, where you have a frequency spectrum of noise, and there's thermal noise up at really high frequencies. There's ground noise at low frequencies, but there's a frequency band right in the sweet spot where you can, through seismic isolation and all kinds of advanced optics and really advanced systems, it's active noise reduction and stuff like that. They can get the noise in certain frequency bands down low enough where they can see certain types of gravitational events. Yeah, but that's also crazy. Even in those bands, one big reason why there are 2 installations, 2 detectors so far away from each other, is they wanted to rule out a local event. So if it's something local up in near Hanford, Washington, Livingston, Louisiana wouldn't see the same signal, but the signals were exactly the same, and they were offset by exactly the amount of time that you would expect. So there's also other detectors, like in Europe, there's one called Virgo, and there's one I think in Japan as well now. And so kind of just like with earthquakes and seismometers, you can triangulate the position. You can triangulate where the gravitational wave event came from by the lag, by when the detectors detect it.
When we lived in the Tri-Cities, we toured the LIGO
neat.
facility. Right. Oh my gosh, it was something.
Amazing, right? I know. It was amazing. I spent most of my time in the lab trying to make photodetectors, but 2 or 3 times a year, I get to go to the sites and help them with a science run or for a meeting or something. It was so amazing to see.
And it's all in the ground, the whole observatory, the pipeline or whatever they're calling it. It was very interesting.
Yeah, super neat, right? Yeah. So predictable. These are physics is predictable, like proven time and time again. On the other hand, organic molecules, especially those with biological effects, are unpredictable. And so that's what we're going to dive into now. So starting with chemical and biological technologies, it can be difficult for a skilled person to predict which function or activity a chemical or biological substance may possess. So this has some advantages in the patent space. So a newly found substance and its use is more likely to be deemed not obvious to the skilled person. So that's would be patentable over, what's called so-called obviousness or 103. But it also creates a burden. So when you try to claim a group of compounds, providing one synthetic route and the activity data of one compound may not be sufficient to support the assumption that all claimed permutations of a certain compound can be synthesized and are active. So another kind of general rule, and I'm going to use these molecules for the next couple of slides to talk about this in a little more detail. There's a known kind of law, rule, and patent in the US and around the world where a generic formula does not necessarily inherently disclose the specific compounds falling under the formula. You might say to yourself, really, that seems odd, but if you take it to its extreme, it makes sense because really no future chemistry invention would ever be possible since all conceivable compounds fall under one known generic formula or another, if you take it to the extreme. A more useful, maybe, and specific example is what we're showing here with a generic formula and then these two other compounds which were modified from it. So this case actually came from the German Supreme Court, but it's a really good example, I think, of these principles. The generic formula 1 does not disclose this claimed compound olanzapine, which is number 2. Claim compound 1 there on the left, you can see a bunch of rings and other things coming off of it, but the important pieces for this discussion are that there are 2 variable groups in that compound, R1 and R2. The claimed compound olanzapine had for R1 nothing, just a hydrogen, and for R2 it had a methane. Another compound from the art, flumezepine, has the same methyl group in R2, but on R1 it has a fluorine. And so the question before the Supreme Court was, is compound 2, the claimed compound, rendered obvious by compound 3? So in order to figure that out, you have to go back to the prior art. This also relates with enablement, but it's easier to talk about with obviousness first. So when you look at the art, the activity data in the prior art all leads one to believe that fluorine would enhance the biological efficacy of this compound. In this case, it was an antipsychotic. And I think very importantly too, the prior art had no individualized compound under the generic Formula 1 that was not halogenated. So basically the prevailing wisdom in this space was that fluorinated, halogenated compounds are beneficial, improve the efficacy. So a person of skill in the art, a posita, had no reason or incentive to modify compound 3 to compound 1 with no halogen, and therefore they found that it was not obvious and it should be allowed. How this relates to enablement is if you general compound 1, if you tried to claim that, you would need to show and enable every variation of R1 and R2. And if you showed a bunch of examples, let's say, and they were all fluorinated or halogenated, that wouldn't necessarily enable compound number 2. Or, from the other perspective, it doesn't make compound number 2 obvious. So does that make sense? Is everybody following at this point? Or is there any questions?
I think the one question I have for you, David, is do you believe then there's kind of this, I feel like at one point broader claims were allowed that maybe you didn't have support for all the different permutations under it, but if you showed enough, like a fourth of the possibilities or something,
No.
then that was enough. But it seems like we're shifting towards this, like some of you are saying, kind of like the death of the genus claim. Do you think that's really happening, and do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a great question. And I don't have a solid answer, like with case law, etc. These cases we're looking at here are all from mainly or from 2008, 2009. So it hasn't changed much, I'd say, in the last sort of decade. So everything that we've been sort of taught, I think still holds. It's not like there's been a change recently or anything. So that's sort of the first comment. But I think putting together best practice from what I've looked at in the prior art, I think and even the MPEP says you don't have to describe every single variation. However, what I think best practice is to extrapolate, to explain to someone how to extrapolate. So by saying R1, let's say, for instance, can be halogenated, but it doesn't have to be halogenated. Things like that. Extrapolate some guidance about which compounds fall in and which compounds don't, and why they all work. I think is the best way to go. But your question is valid, and I think it's a bit of a gray area that comes down to, unfortunately, I think the individual examiner that you may be dealing with, but also probably in some cases, and it maybe in many cases, something that would really come out in litigation, not so much in prosecution.
Yeah, that's fair. I think it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens longer term with some of these, especially the chemical side of the world, and kind of what happens over time if you can show support for some and some guidance, like you said, is that going to be enough for the courts, or do we have to do more?
What I think is how I've started to think about this, and putting this together for me was really helpful, is that I think there are some general kind of logical questions you can ask yourself. Looking at a claim language, would someone be able to make and use every variation that I'm describing here, including synthesis, and including and including, is it enabled? Have we shown that every variation has efficacy? And so if that generic compound on the left with R1 and R2, considering how many things R1 and R2 could be, I think having I'm not that familiar with antipsychotics, so I'm not sure what a good example there would be. But putting the enough description that you not only have, like you said, maybe a quarter or some reasonable fraction of concrete examples, but also logic and direction for how to extrapolate between them to arrive at anything that you're claiming.
Yeah, I think very interesting point. Do you think it's, because some would argue that a person skilled in the art to make and use the claim just has to be able to, based on the claim language and the stuff in the spec, has to be able to make one chemical that fits the bill. But you also kind of said something interesting. You said, somebody would have to be able to kind of make all the permutations. So do you think do you think we need to enable them to make one, or do you think we need to enable them to make all of the things that falls under the claim?
All.
Interesting.
All. And there may even be some quotes from some case law that support that, but everything that I've been reading says, yes, not only supporting what the compound is and all variations, but also how to make, how to synthesize them and how to use them, what the biological efficacy is, not just for some examples, but really somehow, not necessarily writing explicitly each one, but teaching someone how to extrapolate. Yeah, or interpolate, if you will. Yeah.
No, it's interesting. And I would agree based on what I've heard and seen, you know what I mean? So it's interesting. So I think there's been a little bit of a shift, over, like I said, over maybe the last couple of decades in that direction. But interesting.
So what we're about to talk about is KSR. And I think KSR is very confusing in this world. So so KSR. So now that was a German case. Shifting over to the U.S. case in 2007, famous landmark U.S. Supreme Court case. really putting more guidelines around what does it mean to be obvious. And so what KSR establishes, there does not need to be an explicit motivation in the prior art to modify teaching to arrive at the claimed subject matter. So what it did say is if there's a finite number of identified predictable solutions that could lead to the claimed solution, then it is likely obvious. However, the underlying technology behind KSR was from a predictable art. It was a mechanism for combining an electronic sensor with an adjustable automobile pedal. So all elements and their functions were known, and the result of a combination of those things was predictable and hence obvious. The courts have since clarified this specifically for chemical and unpredictable arts. And so the CIFC at least has ruled that there still needs to be some reason, motivation to modify a starting compound to arrive at the claimed compound. So I think this is interesting, and this is possibly partially where the gray area and confusion comes from, is that it's basically exactly the opposite of what KSR says, right? No motivation is needed, and they say, well, no, in some cases a motivation is needed. So here's an example of this case. I think we actually have covered this one before, the Isai versus Dr. Reddy's laboratory in Teva Pharmaceuticals. The CAFC found, so lansoprazole was known from the art, and a very similar compound, lebeprazole, was claimed. And interestingly, again, the known compound was halogenated, had those 3 fluorines down there on the right bottom corner, but the claimed compound did not have the fluorines, was not halogenated. And so the CAFC again did not find any motivation in the art to substitute the active groups. And a quote from that case, the record shows no discernible reason for a skilled artisan to begin with lansoprazole only to drop the very feature, the fluorinated substituent, that gave this advantageous property. So, this kind of, again, to me, this shows that if someone had described this class of compounds and said it could be halogenated, but by the way, it doesn't have to be halogenated. It can have this group at the end, it could have that group, it could have a methyl, it could have that. I think there's a pretty good chance that this case specifically would have come out differently. But since it's acknowledged that these fields are unpredictable and small changes can change the efficacy in ways that are not easy to discern beforehand by one skilled in the art, this was deemed non-obvious. And again, I think it's a good illustrative example when you think about enablement. How do you enable a class of compounds to have all kinds of different groups at the end? And not only, I think, and this is where you're getting into possibly what I was going to say is not technically the best case, put this way, the best case you would have, not only you would describe structures, you'd also describe how to synthesize all of those, and that they would still have biological efficacy, which if you think about it, in this case, is a pretty high bar. How do you know if it's going to be an antipsychotic or not? So it makes it pretty difficult for people to just claim a whole bunch of compounds without actually going through and having the data. I think that's where sometimes this is equated with experimental data. And I think that's an example of how experimental data can be required almost at some point in order to really fully enable something.
So if you do enable something in your spec like that, you have what you need, but you also have some description for some things that are not exactly fully covered correctly. They're just kind of listed elements.
Yep.
What about arguments around unexpected results? If you have like data in your spec that isn't necessarily talked about, but it's put in there as experimental data, can you make those arguments and come out on top?
Are you asking, would that data possibly be enabling for those
Yes.
other? It could be. I think it comes down to the case. I mean, do you really need experimental data to prove that something has antipsychotic effects? Or this is an ulcer, to treat ulcers, right? It's a good question. do you actually need to prove it with experimental data, or is a statement enough?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I only ask because when I get into that territory, I actually think this is the worst possible thing I could be arguing, but it's all I have, right?
Right. Exactly. And I think, especially some of the later cases where you're gonna see things exactly in that camp, where there was a couple of things that were described really well, but the claim language was broader and covered things that weren't described that well, and they were invalidated for lack of enablement. So I think it's definitely something, like you said, in the specification and making sure the description is good, but then really looking at the claim language and being like, how broad is this, and what should we go after? What do we really have here?
Okay.
And I'd almost argue that, I mean, it seems to me lately that, statements are not enough in the spec, that they really, which is a huge burden, arguably, for inventors and labs. If you have to, I mean, you could argue it's their choice, right? For how much broad coverage do you want? But if you have to have, even just some kind of basic kind of data for n number of compounds, that, delays how quickly you can move for any one particular goal.
Yeah. I really, it's exactly right. I mean, there are some benefits to being able to claim something is an unexpected result or non-obvious, but there's some large burdens with having to have the data. And I've actually, maybe as a quick aside, I've talked to some scientists in this field that, as particularly scientists at startup and small companies, that are like, this is super important, and I'm so glad that the system is like that. Otherwise, Dow and DuPont would have patented everything already. They could just list giant lists of compounds and just patent them without having data, without knowing if they work. And so, there's pros and cons, I think,
Yeah, I think that's really fair, because I think that was some of what you saw in the early chemical arts too, not from all the different compounds, but one compound that they found worked for some kind of condition, and then they would list paragraphs of other conditions that were so cursorily related to the target condition that you're you have no idea if this is going to work for MS, and there it is.
Right. And I would imagine, that an examiner during prosecution is not going to be able to answer all those questions. There's not enough time. There's not enough motivation for them to do that. I don't even know if it's really in their marching orders, within their scope. Those sort of things I feel like are most often come up in litigation. So unpredictable arts, detailed description and supporting examples. Summarizing that, if you want to claim a class of compounds, you need to make sure the class is enabled over the whole range. You're in full possession of the invention on the filing date, which is related to something that we were talking about, and that the activity of the underlying claim compound is also present over the whole range claimed. And that's really key. The claim language gets to be very important. Just a couple of examples of this before I kind of finish up this section. Additional examples. There's Abbey versus Janssen, which was invalidated a claim for a class of antibodies. Then there was no structural definition in the claim, no structural definition in the patent at all, only defined functionally in terms of certain dissociation constants at certain binding sites. And the quote there was, the claim scope reaches beyond what the inventors have contributed to the art, right? This is the grand bargain in a way. You teach the world how to make and use something in exchange for a limited amount of exclusivity, so that after the patent term expires, you've now contributed something to the world. Whereas if you don't enable something, now you aren't really holding up your end of the bargain, and then therefore no patent for you. And Wyeth versus Abbott, in a similar case, there was a broad genus claim with only one supported single compound. And what the case, the opinion said in this case, and these are 2013, 2014 cases, slightly more recent. In that case, the skilled person would have had to synthesize and biologically evaluate thousands of compounds to see if they have the claimed properties. So that, in this in the CAFC's opinion in this case, evaluating thousands of compounds was undue experimentation. Now, if you only had to do 10 or 5 or 100, where is that line exactly? I think it's hard to say. I think it may be case by case in some ways. And that was the rapamycin case, which I think we've also talked about in other meetings that we've had. So, okay, we've talked a lot about the pitfalls. What to do? What do we do in unpredictable arts? I think in the specification, cover as much breadth as possible with examples and data, both synthesis and activity, and also provide guidance in the description how to extrapolate from the examples given to the remaining scope. And now we're going to shift into emerging technologies, but another thing that's as important here, this is more, I think this slide really covers what to do in the specification. In the claims, it's really important to pick phrases and to claim things that are enabled. Think about the genus claim and all the species that go underneath that sort of a claim, and are they really all enabled? And if not, maybe you're better off with some kind of a Marcuse group or narrowing in some other way to make sure that it is. So that was predictable and unpredictable. Biological and chemical are really the main examples there. Emerging technologies is similar. It's a lot of related concepts, but it's a bit different in that the question here is, how much does a patent specification rely on the knowledge of a person or of ordinary skill in the art to provide support for certain claimed embodiments? If a technology is very new, there may be very little information out in the field, and a posita in that field may actually not have very much knowledge. So you need to err on the side of disclosing more enablement. How is this made? All the different components that go into something. Naturally, that can create a tension between a company's desire to protect valuable trade secrets versus the need to provide an enabling disclosure. So what is an emerging technology? It's hard to define. We'll go through some examples, which I think are very illustrative, but even in the previous case, it's a little bit difficult, with unpredictable arts, it's a little bit difficult to know exactly how much enablement is necessary. Similar kind of questions occur here from a different perspective, not so much unpredictability, but if it's so new, there might not be a lot of information out there. So you might need to put a little bit more background, a little bit more enablement of different components and things like that of your systems than you would otherwise. So as we've been talking about, and this is that predictable arts, historically, predictable arts can be enabled by a single example. This was a landmark case in 1987 which was spectrophysics versus coherent, where this was established. New fields, however, even if they're predictable, may not rely on knowledge of a posita to satisfy disclosure obligations to the same extent. And the example we're going to go through in a minute here is automotive technologies versus BMW, which was the 2006 case. And there's actually some recent cases from 2018 and 2019, which also deal with some newer emerging technologies, and that how to enable that such that a posita can make and use the entire claim scope without undue experimentation. So there's a couple of cases on that as well that I've listed there. But to dive into this automotive technologies case, because I think it's very interesting, goes back. This was a 2006 decision, but the application was filed in 1992. The CAFC in this case found all claims invalid due to lack of enablement, and it dealt with crash sensing devices in cars. So when airbags were deployed. In 1992, airbag deployment sensors were arguably still an emerging technology. And what's interesting in this case is that, and I have this claim on the next slide, there was a broad claim which covered a lot of different embodiments. The specification described an embodiment of the device utilizing a mechanical sensor in considerable detail. You can see those. I pulled out some figures on the right there from the actual patent, and all different kinds of mechanical sensors were shown. It also described using an electronic sensor, but included less detail, no figures, and only a paragraph or two of explanation of that. I think this is even the thing that sticks out in my mind the most. At trial, an expert testified that a positive could use off-the-shelf components and well-known circuit design and programming to create everything within the claimed scope. And I don't think that there was any argument about that. Off-the-shelf components, well-designed circuit design, well-known circuit design and programming, that there was no argument about that. That was true. However, the CAFC still said it was invalid due to lack of enablement, because if you look at this claim, the claim is a side impact crash sensor. It has a housing, it has a mass, and then C, means responsive to the motion of said mass upon acceleration of said housing in excess of a predetermined threshold for initiating an occupant protection apparatus. So really all the claim said is means for initiating. And this airbag system. And they described in detail some possible ways to do that mechanically, but there are a lot of different ways to do that, and they hadn't enabled all of them in the specification. Even though the sort of vague, let's say, the minimal description that they did include could have been made using off-the-shelf components, it's still, the claim language, I feel like, really hurt them in this case. It was so broad, and their disclosure was really focused in one area that they ended up losing the entire patent. So, any comments about that one? I really, this to me was very interesting, and I thought it made me think a little differently about alternative embodiments. A client may have a main kind of angle that they're going after, described really well, all kinds of mechanical drawing. And they're like, oh, but you could also do it these other ways. If it's an emerging technology, if there's not a lot of information out there about the general space, having a broad claim that covers everything could be risky. You may want to, one or the other, narrow the claim or beef up the description of the other embodiments, even if you're like, this is all off the shelf, this is all known. In this case, at least in the automotive technologies case, that would have made a big difference, I think.
This kind of surprises me, honestly, because it does, to me, this seems like but I guess, I would agree that the claim hurt them, but if you just think about the spec, it seems kind of crazy, that, because I would consider this, pretty highly predictable art, right? Yes, emerging, but highly predictable. So it seems a little, I don't know if Kristen has anything, coming from the more predictable side of the world, if you have any thoughts, does this surprise you or whatever, is it really just a problem of the claims? They went kind of a little too crazy with the claims.
Well, it surprises me because it's back from 92, and that in 06, they decided that this was why, this was too broad, and this was how we were going to knock this out of the water. That seems like a lot of time and a lot of tech time too, including electronics development, right? Chips, semiconductors, etc. So that's peculiar. But when you look at the claim language itself, it really is quite broad. And so when you begin to use a means responsive to the motion of the mass upon acceleration, that could be almost anything. So I guess what I do when I see claims like this, and Ashley can attest to this because I'm always asking her, hey, do you know this could read on this, or this? And she does the same to me. And it just makes you remember that, be really careful. Don't try to claim a cardboard cooler when you're really trying to claim a freezing device, right? With all the electronics and whatnot.
Yeah.
So even though this is a great first claim and a first idea of this is everything that's needed, you do have to ask yourself as a practitioner as you go through just the claim that you wrote, what else does this read on? How else could this be taken? Because this, to me, there's a lot of things that this could be.
I think some of the other problem too that I've been realizing is I think, there's this like ideal that everybody has, that I want this really broad claim and blah, blah, blah. But honestly, the best, and I think this your presentation, Dave, is kind of hitting at this, that the best claim is really one that is narrow to the product that you are developing that has significant commercial, patient, clinical, whatever impact, but is broad in every other aspect, right? And so it's,
Agreed.
like Chris and I have talked about this before, like every catheter, for example, has X features. So you don't need to go nitty gritty in every single feature that every single catheter has, but is there one thing of your catheter that has clinical efficacy? Okay, so claim that narrowly, not crazy narrow, but, within reason, and then leave everything else broad, because at the end of the day, like the competitors are going to copy that one thing and stick it on their own catheter that maybe is slightly different. But again, like a catheter is a catheter is a catheter, generally speaking. So, keeping that in mind, that broad claims aren't actually all they're cracked up to be.
Yeah. Like what's the invention in a way, right?
Yeah, exactly. Don't get lost in this lofty, and I think it's hard because I think market pressures, investors, all these things I think have this pressure on companies. Oh, you have to have this like broad claim. It's like, well, but is that really the good decision, or does that just like look good on paper but ends up causing problems later?
Yeah, that's exactly what this whole investigation has exactly made me start thinking of that way too. And I feel like in a way, this is something that, I don't know, I've always thought this way. And in some ways, this is like, I want to look at the prior art, and I want to make sure that whatever we're claiming doesn't read on something in the art. And this is giving me another kind of perspective on it. I want to make sure that what we're claiming is actually also enabled, that we've taught someone how to make and use everything within the scope of this claim,
Yeah. And I will tell you, even if a larger company got this broad claim, it's really typical of large companies who have a lot of money to spend on IP to say, great, we got this nice broad claim, let's go a different direction with it in a couple of continuations, just to protect the original. If for some reason like this happened, the original's gone away, right?
Right. So very similar case, actually, DreamWorks Citric, individual inventor versus DreamWorks. Again, all claims were found invalid due to lack of enablement. The claim was describing integrating a user's audio or visual signal into a pre-existing video game or movie. And the specification was 99% about video games. And then they also kind of mentioned movies. And that's, again, what hurt him here. The district court essentially said that it was lack of enablement as to movies, but they didn't even talk about whether it was would have been enabled for video games. And again, here's the claim language, which it's just that the presentation output, and it's this presentation output was vague. And if it was a video game, that may have gotten through. But since it was vague and movies and other types of presentation outputs were not enabled, it was invalidated. So very kind of similar thing. And so what to do in emerging arts and unpredictable arts, again, cover as much breadth as possible with examples, provide guidance of how to extrapolate. And additionally, I would say for emerging technologies, which will, as we've talked about, may be a little difficult to define precisely. But if you're working in a field that is relatively new, err on the side of describing things more completely. Even if something is off the shelf or a component or a circuit, it should be known. In the description, having a little bit more description in there would probably be a worthwhile use of resources. And then carefully consider the scope of the claim terms being construed and make sure that the breadth is really this goal in the Goldilocks situation. It's not too broad, it's not too narrow, but it's broad enough that the art's not going to read on it, and it's narrow enough that it's going to be enabled. And then I think another thing that we often talk about with clients, but maybe even more applicable here, is maybe in certain cases, in order to fully enable something, you're going to have to give up too much. You're going to have to describe too many process parameters and other things that would not be reverse engineerable, and therefore might be better kept as a claim secret, as a trade secret, rather than going into a claim in a patent.
David,
Yeah.
what's your quick question? What's your thoughts on, so now I just lost my train of thought on, pointing. So let's say you are an emerging field, right?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, or have you seen, pointing to some art, like maybe not like pointing to like, here's the perfect prior that choose exactly the same thing, because ideally that's not the case, but especially if it's emerging, but pointing to certain art somewhere in the background that kind of lays the groundwork for this new emerging field to kind of set the stage that, this is the shoulders that we're stepping on, and here's the state of it.
Yeah.
Like, have you seen that, or would you recommend that, or?
This is a great question. And more or less, I guess that's what some of the articles that I was reading were advising. Not in so many words, more between the lines, I guess. But from these last few cases, especially, I think it's 1992. Your average car, maybe no car has ever had an airbag in it. So this is something new. And they said to themselves, everybody knows how to use an electronic circuit to trigger a squib to then explode an airbag or whatever. But I think that they miscalculated. And I think what they would have been better served by doing would be, hey, this is a new system or a subsystem. And also, here's a circuit, here's a chip that you can use to control a squib, or you could do it this way, or you can do it that way. Even though I think they were just relying too much on the prior art and not explicitly stating how to make it, how to use it. I think oftentimes when I've been in the situation, and other people I've heard say, if it's in the art, if you can point to a textbook, let's say, that has this information in it, then you don't really need to describe it in detail. And I think in some cases it might actually be okay. Sure, in many cases it's probably good advice. And in some cases, though, in emerging fields, you might want to go that extra little bit and describe a little bit more, even if you're like, someone should know this. Still, I don't think hurts to be a little more comprehensive.
Yeah, I think this is one of those cases where this shouldn't be the case, but I think it is you have to remember your audience. And the audience isn't just the inventors, it's really the courts. And I would argue that historically, judges and things like that have not been as technology savvy as maybe they should be to be weighing in on these topics. So I think you have to kind of remember your audience to some degree. Yes, patents are supposed to be written for one of skill in the art, but I think they also need to be read for judges and attorneys and things like that maybe aren't as skilled as apposita. So I think that's kind of the weird balance you got to strike too, is that yes, it's written for apposita, but it's also written for people who need to interpret it and make judgments on it, and they're not apposita.
Good point. Yeah, it makes sense. Absolutely.
Well, and from my perspective, I never put prior art specific content in my spec. I never point to like in this patent or like in that textbook or as well known in whatever. If I need to say something like that in order to not first denigrate the art and second tie myself to that piece of art, like they do in Europe, right? European style summaries have that. They want to know the closest prior art and then begin at your invention. But I never do that. I was taught to never do that. It could only hurt you from a, well, look at this disclosure. It talks about this and you've covered this and said this is new, but this other disclosure talks about it. Even though it doesn't do exactly what you say, it talks about it. And that can just be a slippery slope. So what I do is I say conventional systems such as blah, 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 perform this, and the claimed subject matter or the disclosure described herein does this instead, or provides this improvement over conventional systems. And so if you seed it in that language, even the courts who go looking for things in your specification to either help you or harm you, can lean on that, and they can say, well, look, this is what conventional systems do, and make sure that's accurate, by the way, right? You can't just make it up. And what they're doing in this invention is quite different, and this is why. Right? So the more you can lean on technical problem, technical effect, technical solution, the better you are.
And like you said, not characterizing the prior art or any specific reference. Yeah.
And then the other thing I had to add was just for a practice tip and things that I think as I draft, in order to make sure everything is described fully in your specification. So let's take your example with the movie and the video game. If you are ever tempted to put a comma delimited list of something in your specification, that should trigger you to think, do I really want to just list these things? Is there anything important in here where these should be broken out into single sentences or examples thoroughly done in full paragraph form?
Interesting.
Or is it really okay to be a list? It's just a trigger, and I don't always do it. And it's a lazy thing that, as practitioners and drafters, we just kind of go, yeah, and this and this and this and this, and move on, right?
Right.
But I do try to make myself think if there's something in that list I really should dive into instead of just list.
Yeah. How similar are they really that the list prevails, or are you shoving things into a list that maybe shouldn't be? Yeah,
because we all do it. You just you take a shortcut because you're like, I am so done with this concept.
20 chemicals in.
Yeah. Or you can't think of anything else. You're like, yeah, list of 3, that's good. And maybe those 3 things should have been 3 paragraphs, not 3 words.
Right, exactly. Well, this is cool, Dave. I appreciate it. And now I know more about the LIGO. Now I have to go see one of those. If they allow external.
Next meeting, I'll do a presentation on LIGO. I've got lots of slides on that.
That's cool. Yeah, I hadn't. Yeah, that's our son is really getting into space, and so we are gonna go to NASA in 2 days. We went a couple years ago, but he was too little to appreciate it. But so it's just you start seeing these huge centers set up to measure phenomena that are crazy far away. It's cool to see.
I will, when I send around the presentation, I'll send a link to a really short video that they made in kind of explaining explaining what LIGO is and the great discovery that they made and everything. And all the people in the video were people that I worked with when I was in grad school. So it's pretty cool.
How fun.
A superstar.
I mean, it's hundreds of people worked on it, right? But it was still a great project. Yeah.
That's cool. That's one of those those grad school projects that you don't have to market very hard.
Right.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you going into enough chemical detail that my high school chemistry and maybe one class of chemistry in college got me there.
Awesome.
Thank you.
She knew the fluorine. She's like, I got the halogen group. I got that.
I know what that is.
Yeah. Awesome. Great. Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks again, Dave, and everybody. I guess have good rest of your week.
Thanks, you too.
Yeah, thanks.
Ashley, enjoy your trip.
I'll soak up some sun for all of you, I promise.
All right, take care.
Have a great week.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and remember to check us out at aurorapatents.com for more great podcasts, blogs, and videos covering all things patent strategy. And if you're an agent or attorney and would like to be part of the discussion, or an inventor with a topic you'd like to hear discussed, email us at podcast@aurorapatents.com. Do remember that this podcast does not constitute legal advice, and until next time, keep calm and patent on.